Today I'm going to read a short extract from chapter 1. Her sister was flirting again. Through a gap in the sea of bodies which straddled the room, Alex could see Erica talking to a young man of lean build and animated expression. The pose and mannerisms were unmistakable, and Alex inwardly smiled. It was a familiar and comforting sight in a world which now felt suddenly quite unreal. She turned as a woman to her right remarked what a lovely service it had been, and expressed her sympathy. Alex immediately thanked her and tried to place the woman's face, but couldn't. A lovely service, was it? She couldn't remember much about it, only the music. You'd think that they'd have gone to more trouble with the music, wouldn't you? Simon had once complained, as they'd left the funeral of an elderly musician friend. I'm sure he'd have preferred to go out in a blaze of strings and brass. I know I would. I'll bear that in mind, Alex had responded flippantly. What would you like, Shostakovich? No, Beethoven. Or what about the 1812? She'd laughed at him then. They hadn't long been married, and she didn't take the comment seriously. He was just 31 at the time, and she was 28. She hadn't yet reached the stage of considering their mortality. Simon was a talented conductor and a rising star in the classical music world. She had a successful singing career. The future looked bright. Perhaps a little composition of your own, she teased. Not a bad idea at that, he said, grinning. If you can't get your music played at your own funeral, when can you? Now here she was, barely 10 years on, listening to a small chamber orchestra, friends and colleagues scratched together at short notice, playing a selection of Simon's pieces. She was standing in the function room of a large hotel in northwest London, still clasping the untouched plate of food Erica had pushed on her, feeling dislocated from the event as if she were trapped inside a transparent bubble. Alexandra, said a booming voice to her left. She turned as a big man wearing a black bow tie, his chin-length hair parted crisply down the centre of his scalp, put his arm round her shoulders. He was a violinist, pompous and difficult to work with, she remembered Simon saying, but she couldn't bring his name to mind. You poor girl, he continued, what you must have been through. I've been reading the papers. Pure conjecture to sell copies. Don't pay any attention to it. That's my advice. I presume the police are happy that it was an accident. They said they haven't closed the case yet. There's going to be an inquest. Is there really? I suppose they have to, but of course it was an accident. He seemed happy enough to me. And he thought the world of you, always singing your praises. No pun intended, of course. Speaking of singing, though, I thought that last recording you made of those Bach cantatas was wonderful. Such vibrancy and yet such lightness of touch. So many sopranos make heavy weather of it. I suppose you'll be wanting a break from singing for a while, but don't leave us for too long, will you? He released her shoulder, picked up her free hand and ostentatiously kissed the back of it before moving off. Alex watched him go, his comments still echoing round her head. Mum says, aren't you going to eat any of that you haven't eaten anything all day? Intoned a young voice, the words tumbling out all on one breath. Alex looked down into the intelligent eyes of an auburn-haired boy beside her and smiled. It was Erica's 10-year-old son, who looked not remotely like his mother. I'm afraid I'm not hungry, Ben, she said apologetically. Mum said you'd say that, and I'm supposed to say... He paused and screwed his eyes up in concentration. It doesn't matter whether you're hungry or not. You should eat. Alex grinned in spite of herself. I'll bet she did. Please, Aunt Alex, Ben pleaded in a resigned voice. You know what Mum's like. You'd better eat something or we'll both get into trouble. Alex sometimes thought Ben was old for his years. Living with Erica would do that to you. She glanced across the room again, but her sister had disappeared. Erica had been a rock ever since Simon's accident. As Alex had frozen into numbed inactivity, Erica had taken charge, taken all the organisation on herself and done what she always did best, made herself indispensable. Alex had chosen the music and readings for the service, and Erica had done everything else. It had been slick and grand. It should be a statement, Erica had said, a celebration of his life and achievements. Simon would have approved. Though often introspective at home, he was a natural performer. He liked occasions. Of course, Erica had been right, and Alex was immensely grateful to her sister for all the trouble she'd taken. but if she'd been free to organise it as she would have wanted, if Simon hadn't seemed in some way to be public property, Alex would have gone for something more intimate and casual, maybe even one of those natural woodland burials. There were too many people here she barely knew, and she didn't find polite conversation easy at the best of times. There again, if she'd had to do it herself, feeling as stupid as she did at the moment, the whole thing would probably have been a shambles. She glanced down at the delicate cordon bleu finger food on her plate, caught Ben's eye watching her, his young forehead puckered into a frown, and forced herself to pick a rolled salmon canapé up and pop it in her mouth. She crinkled her eyes up into a smile for his benefit. "Just keep chewing and swallowing," Ben said, "like I do with Mum's steak and kidney pie. It goes down in the end, trust me." Alex tried to oblige, but her mouth was dry and it took a while to swallow. "I'm thinking of becoming a vegetarian," he confided. "Lots of naturalists are vegetarian. It makes sense, really." "Oh?" Alex looked at the remaining food on her plate. Under Ben's watchful gaze, she picked up a frighteningly orange-filled vol au vent. "Have you told your mum?" "I mentioned it. She said it wasn't healthy while you're still growing, but then she doesn't know anything about it. She'll come round with time. I'll work on her." Ben slipped away again, and Alex replaced the vol au vent on her plate as another succession of people came up to pay their respects. It was the back end of November, and already more than 4 weeks since Simon had died. Alex had been in Vienna doing a series of concerts at the Kursalon when Erica rang her late one afternoon to tell her that Simon had fallen under a tube train on the Victoria line in London. "He's alive," Erica had said, "but badly hurt. You should come quickly, Alex." She'd left Vienna on the first available flight. But Simon had never regained consciousness and was dead long before she could get to the hospital. Then there'd been the official identification of the body and a brief interview with the police. It had been a few days later when the police had asked to see her again. There were inconsistencies in the witness statements, the inspector said. They needed to clarify a few things. "Were you happy together, Mrs. Brooke?" was his opening gambit. "Of course." She frowned. "Why?" He grunted and then glanced at his notes before raising questioning eyes to her face. "Or should I call you Miss Monroe?" "I use my maiden name for performing. Well, for most things, really. It's easier." "I see." He said everything as if it had some significance, but she failed to see what it was. "You spent a lot of time apart, I understand." "It was the nature of our jobs. We did occasionally work together, but that's how we met in the first place. But inevitably not that often. You have to go where the work is." "I see. And you have no children?" "No. No." He paused and lifted his eyes slowly to her face. "And there wasn't anyone else involved?" The question took her completely off guard. No, of course not." He raised his eyebrows and sighed. "I'm afraid, Miss Monroe," he said in a gentler voice, "there's reason to believe that your husband may have committed suicide." "Suicide? I thought it was an accident." "Some witnesses said it looked as if your husband stepped out purposely as the tube train came into the station. Of course the platform was very crowded and it was difficult to see, but they said it seemed very sudden. Did your husband have any problems, Mrs. Brooke? Was there anything the matter in his work? Were there any money worries, perhaps?" Dazed, she shook her head. She and Simon were blessed with money, a nice home in Hampstead and a comfortable, albeit hectic, life. "You'll forgive me for pressing the point," the inspector persisted, "but in the circumstances I have to ask. You don't have a lover. It isn't possible your husband recently found out about it." "No, for God's sake, no." He nodded slowly. "And you haven't found a note?" "If I had, I'd have told you," she said crisply. "Good. Well, if you do, you will inform us, won't you?" She stood up to go, angry and upset, but he hadn't quite finished. "And do you think your husband had any enemies, Miss Monroe?" "Enemies?" Alex frowned, genuinely confused. "No, not as far as I know. Why?" "There was one witness who said she thought he'd been pushed. I understand you were out of the country when it happened." "Yes, I was in Vienna." "Why, what are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, but it's important we check everything. I'm sure that's what you would want us to do as well." "Thank you for your cooperation. We'll be able to reach you at this number in London, I assume. Now she looked across the room and saw the last of the funeral guests speak to Erica before leaving. Alex found the policeman's questions circulating in her head once more. She dismissed the idea that Simon might have any enemies who wished him dead as unthinkable. But what had taken him down to the station that day? He hated the underground. She was incessantly haunted by the implication, barely disguised in the policeman's remarks, that she was responsible in some way for his death.